Area 51 is a name that echoes through American history like a whispered warning, a place where the desert swallows secrets and the sky itself seems to watch back. We've heard of UFOs, alien autopsies, and stealth aircraft, but buried deeper than all of those legends is something far more unsettling. During the Cold War, a revolutionary aircraft program was born here, tested here, and then erased so completely that it never appeared in official records. No budget lines, no public acknowledgments, no memorials for the men who worked on it. Tonight, we uncover the lost aircraft program of Area 51, the one the government never admitted existed. Welcome to Untold Golden History, where forgotten truths rise from silence and the past speaks louder than denial. Tonight's story is not just about machines and metal, it is about ambition, fear, sacrifice, and the heavy cost of secrecy. This is the true story of Area 51's lost aircraft program that never made it to records. Long before conspiracy theories turned Area 51 into a cultural myth, the land itself was already hostile to human presence. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly, flat, cracked, and unforgiving. Summer temperatures soared above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, while winter nights dropped below freezing. Winds carried fine sand that cut into skin and machinery alike. It was a place designed by nature to hide things. In 1955, when the U.S. government quietly acquired land around Groom Lake, it was not because of aliens or science fiction dreams. It was because the Cold War had reached a boiling point. The Soviet Union was testing nuclear weapons. Spy planes were being shot down. Intelligence gaps could mean national extinction. Area 51, though not officially named that at the time, became a sanctuary for ideas that were too dangerous, too advanced, or too politically risky to exist anywhere else. Workers arrived under false pretenses. Many were told they were going to weather research stations or radar testing facilities. They signed non-disclosure agreements so strict that violating them could lead to prison or worse. Families were told nothing. Wives received phone calls from husbands who couldn't say where they were, only that they were safe and working for the country. And somewhere within this guarded silence, a program began that would never be officially acknowledged. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, American military planners were terrified. The U-2 spy plane had already proven vulnerable. In 1960, Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, igniting an international crisis. The message was clear: the sky was no longer safe. Military strategists demanded something impossible: an aircraft that could fly faster, higher, and remain invisible to radar. Not incrementally better, radically different. At Area 51, a small group of engineers, physicists, and test pilots were assembled under a classification level so high that even many Pentagon officials didn't know the full scope of their work. The project did not have a conventional name. Internally, it was referred to only by shifting code phrases that changed every few months. This was intentional. Names created paper trails created evidence. The goal was not just to build an aircraft, but to leap decades ahead of known aviation technology. Those selected for the program were the best in their fields and the most disposable. Engineers were recruited from Lockheed's Skunk Works, Northrop, and secret military research labs. Some had worked on the SR-81 Blackbird. Others were experts in material science, propulsion, and early stealth theory, fields so new they barely existed in textbooks. Test pilots were chosen for their silence as much as their skill. Many were former combat pilots who had already seen friends die in experimental aircraft. They understood the risks. They also understood that if something went wrong here, no one would ever know. Every Monday morning, unmarked buses picked them up from Las Vegas. Windows were blacked out. Armed guards rode along. The trip took hours, though no one could tell exactly how long. At Area 51, there were no insignias, no unit patches, no personal photographs allowed. People were known by badge numbers more often than names. One engineer later described the atmosphere as a mix of brilliance and dread, like working inside a locked vault that was slowly running out of air. The Lost Aircraft program focused on designs that defied conventional understanding. Witness accounts, shared decades later under anonymity, describe a craft that looked nothing like standard airplanes: no vertical stabilizers, angled surfaces that absorbed radar rather than reflecting it, experimental composite materials layered with radar-absorbing coatings long before stealth became public knowledge. Its propulsion system was even more radical. Instead of relying solely on traditional jet engines, the aircraft experimented with hybrid propulsion, combining turbojet principles with ramjet-like behavior at extreme speeds. Engineers pushed materials beyond known thermal limits. Some parts reportedly glowed red during flight tests. Flights were conducted only at night. When the aircraft took off, workers were ordered indoors, cameras were confiscated, radios went silent. Even radar operators were sometimes given false readings to mask the aircraft's true profile. Test pilots later recalled that flying it felt unnatural, as if the aircraft resisted the air itself. Control responses were delayed at times, then violently overcorrected at others. Several pilots described moments where they believed the craft was actively trying to kill them, and sometimes it succeeded. Between the early 1960s and the mid-1970s, multiple fatal accidents occurred during the program's testing phase. Officially, these deaths never happened. When a test aircraft crashed, recovery teams sealed the area within minutes. Debris was collected under floodlights. Any civilian witnesses, as rare as they were in the empty desert, were detained, questioned, and warned. Families of deceased pilots received vague explanations: training accident, mechanical failure during classified operations. Coffins were sealed, funerals were closed coffin. One widow later said, "It was like my husband died twice, once in the crash, and once when the world told he never really existed." This silence was not accidental. The program's existence itself was considered a threat to national security. If the Soviet Union learned how far American technology had advanced, or how unstable it still was, it could provoke escalation. So the program continued, hidden beneath layers of lies. As years passed, the psychological toll grew unbearable for many involved. Engineers watched colleagues disappear overnight, transferred, reassigned, or simply gone. No explanations were given. Rumors spread of nervous breakdowns, forced retirements, and hospitalizations at military psychiatric facilities. Speaking about work, even accidentally, could destroy lives. One technician reportedly lost his custody of his children after being accused of security instability. Another was blacklisted from the entire aerospace industry after raising concerns about safety protocols. The cruelty was not always loud. Often it was administrative, quiet, efficient. And yet, amid the fear, there was belief. Belief that this suffering meant something, that this aircraft, this impossible machine would one day protect the nation, that history would eventually understand. But history never came. By the late 1970s, technology had shifted. Computers became more powerful. New stealth concepts emerged that were safer, more reliable, and easier to reproduce. The Lost Aircraft program began to look inconvenient. It had cost billions in secret funding, it had claimed lives, and worst of all, it was difficult to justify without revealing too much. Quietly, the program was dismantled. Test flights stopped, hangars were cleared, documents were destroyed or reclassified under entirely different projects. Engineers were reassigned to programs that would later become public, like the F-117 Nighthawk, without any acknowledgement of where their ideas originated. The aircraft itself, its final fate remains unknown. Some believe it was dismantled piece by piece.
Others believe it still sits buried beneath the desert, sealed in a reinforced hangar, never to fly again. What is certain is this: officially, it never existed. Decades later, as Cold War secrecy loosened up, fragments of the truth began to surface: anonymous interviews, declassified memos with suspicious redactions, engineers who waited until retirement or terminal illness before whispering what they knew. These were not men chasing fame, they were men chasing closure. They wanted the world to know that brilliance had lived in that desert, that courage had flown at night without applause, that innovation often comes at a human cost history prefers to forget. And slowly, through stories like this, the silence began to crack.
Buried Foundations of Area 51. To understand how Area 51 could hide an entire aircraft program from history, one must first understand how the base itself was engineered, not just physically, but bureaucratically. Area 51 was never meant to exist in paperwork the way other military installations did. Unlike Fort Bragg or Edwards Air Force Base, Groom Lake operated in fragments. Funding was split across unrelated projects. Construction contracts were disguised as civilian infrastructure work. Even supply chains were intentionally confusing. Parts shipped under fake destinations, mislabeled as agricultural equipment or mining machinery. This fragmented system was perfected during the Cold War. It allowed massive projects to function without leaving a single clear paper trail. And for the lost aircraft program, this structure was essential. The hangars built for the project were unlike any others: wider doors, deeper foundations, reinforced ceilings. Engineers later revealed that these hangars were designed to accommodate aircraft shapes that did not conform to standard wingspans or fuselage lengths. Some designs required vertical clearance unheard of at the time. Even the runways were altered. Groom Lake's dry lake bed was expanded and compacted to support extreme takeoff speeds. Specialized arrest systems were installed, not for emergency landings, but for aircraft that could not safely decelerate using traditional braking. Every physical change whispered the same truth. This was not an incremental experiment. This was a gamble against the limits of physics. Many of the engineers assigned to the program later described it as the most intellectually demanding work of their lives. They were asked to solve problems no one had ever solved before. How do you design an aircraft that remains stable at speeds where airflow behaves more like liquid than gas? How do you cool materials exposed to temperatures that melt steel? How do you hide an object moving faster than radar systems were designed to track? Early stealth theory was still primitive. Radar-absorbing materials were unreliable. Mathematical models were incomplete. Computers were slow and scarce. So the engineers relied on intuition, hand calculations, and endless trial and error. Some became obsessed. They slept in their offices. They scribbled equations on napkins, walls, even their own arms. Others cracked under the pressure. One physicist reportedly collapsed during a briefing after realizing that a minor miscalculation could cause catastrophic structural failure at Mach speeds. Another resigned quietly after stating, "We're building something we don't yet understand and flying it anyway." But resignation was not always permitted. In several cases, engineers were told that leaving the program would trigger additional security scrutiny. Their careers and reputations were held hostage by secrecy. They stayed, and they built. The first test flights were disasters narrowly avoided. Pilots described takeoffs that felt like being launched from a cannon. Acceleration forces pushed blood away from the brain. At high altitude, control surfaces behaved unpredictably, responding seconds late or all at once. On one early flight, the aircraft reportedly entered an uncontrolled roll at extreme speed. The pilot fought the controls for nearly 30 seconds, a lifetime in aviation, before the craft stabilized. When he landed, his hands were shaking so violently that ground crew had to help him out of the cockpit. He never flew again. Another pilot experienced sudden electrical failure mid-flight. Backup systems engaged too late. Only sheer instinct and luck prevented a fatal crash. Every incident was documented, but never formally investigated. No safety boards, no recommendations, no accountability. Instead, the response was always the same: refine the design and try again. By the mid-1960s, the program had consumed hundreds of millions of dollars, hidden across classified budgets. But money was not the true cost. The human cost was staggering. Marriages collapsed under the weight of secrecy. Children grew up believing their parents didn't trust them. Engineers missed births, funerals, and entire chapters of family life. Some workers developed chronic anxiety. Others turned to alcohol. A few reportedly took their own lives, though no official connection to the program was ever acknowledged. Medical issues were common. Exposure to experimental fuels and coatings caused respiratory problems and skin conditions. Doctors were often kept in the dark about what patients had been exposed to, making treatment difficult. And yet, workers were reminded, this is bigger than you. Patriotism became both motivation and weapon. The cover-up was not passive, it was enforced. The Office of Special Investigations monitored personnel continuously. Phone calls were listened to, mail was intercepted, social circles were analyzed. If someone began asking too many questions or expressing doubts, they were flagged. Some were transferred to irrelevant positions. Others were pressured into early retirement. A few were subjected to psychological evaluations that conveniently declared them unstable. The message was unmistakable: speak and your life will unravel. Even decades later, many survivors refused to speak openly. Those who did insisted on anonymity, fearing repercussions long after the Cold War had ended. Because secrecy, once internalized, does not fade easily. The urgency behind the program intensified whenever intelligence reports suggested Soviet advances. Rumors spread within Area 51 that Soviet radar systems were improving rapidly, that surface-to-air missiles were becoming more precise, that American air superiority was slipping. Whether these fears were accurate or not mattered less than how they were used. Each threat justified greater risks. Engineers were pushed to cut corners. Pilots were urged to fly profiles that exceeded tested limits. Failures were reframed as necessary data. One internal memo, later partially declassified, suggested that losing an aircraft was acceptable if it delayed Soviet detection capabilities by even a few months. Human life was never mentioned. For some inside the program, the breaking point came quietly. An engineer reviewing long-term projections realized that even if the aircraft succeeded technically, it would be nearly impossible to deploy operationally. Maintenance requirements were extreme, costs were astronomical, pilot training alone would take years. The aircraft was brilliant, but impractical. Worse, newer technologies were emerging that could achieve similar goals with fewer risks. This realization spread slowly, like a virus. Suddenly, the sacrifices felt meaningless. The deaths, the secrecy, the lives put on hold, all for a machine that might never see combat or recognition. When the decision came, it was swift and silent. No announcement, no debriefing. Personnel were informed individually. Your project is ending. You're being reassigned. Your clearance level is changing. Files were collected, hard drives wiped, blueprints shredded or locked away. The hangars emptied. And just like that, a decade-spanning effort vanished. Not canceled, not failed, simply erased. Ironically, the lost aircraft program succeeded in ways no one could publicly acknowledge. Its research influenced stealth geometry, thermal management, and high-speed aerodynamics. Ideas born in secret quietly reappeared in later acknowledged aircraft. The engineers watched their work resurface under different names, credited to different teams. Some felt pride, others felt betrayal, but all understood one thing: history would never thank them.
Strange sightings without explanations. Long before the public associated Area 51 with flying saucers and extraterrestrials, residents of Nevada and neighboring states were already seeing things they could not explain. In the 1960s and early 1970s, commercial pilots reported unidentified high-altitude objects moving at impossible speeds. Radar operators at civilian airports occasionally tracked blips that appeared, vanished, and reappeared miles away within seconds. Air traffic controllers logged anomalies they were instructed never to discuss again. Officially, these were dismissed as weather balloons, instrument glitches, or misidentified stars. Unofficially, some within the lost aircraft program knew better. Test flights were deliberately scheduled during windows when civilian air traffic was minimal. Even so, complete isolation was impossible. The aircraft's extreme altitude and velocity meant it could cross vast distances in minutes. To those who glimpsed it, the craft appeared unreal, silent, angular, and unnaturally fast. Some described it as a black shadow cutting through the stars. Others said it left no visible exhaust, no contrail, only a faint shimmer. These sightings became the seed of countless UFO reports, and that was convenient. The myth of aliens became the perfect camouflage for human secrecy. Inside intelligence circles, the realization came quickly. Public obsession with extraterrestrials was a gift. If people believed they were seeing alien technology, they were less likely to suspect classified American aircraft. So the narrative was quietly encouraged. Tabloids were allowed to speculate wildly. Whistleblowers talking about non-human craft were ridiculed rather than investigated. The truth was buried beneath absurdity. The lost aircraft program hid in plain sight, disguised as fantasy. Some engineers found this darkly amusing. Others found it horrifying. They were watching their life's work transformed into a joke. When the program ended, its people did not simply return to normal life. They carried the sky with them. Former pilots woke from nightmares, reliving moments when control was slipping away at Mach speeds. Engineers obsessed over equations long after retirement, haunted by problems left unsolved. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as PTSD, but without acknowledgement or treatment. They couldn't talk about what they'd done, couldn't explain why they woke up screaming, couldn't tell their children why the sound of a jet engine made them freeze. Their silence became a second prison. One former test pilot later confided anonymously, "I flew faster than anyone I knew, and I've never felt more alone." The lost aircraft program didn't just consume individuals, it consumed families. Spouses lived with constant uncertainty. Children learned early not to ask questions. Some marriages survived, many didn't. One engineer's daughter later recalled, "My father was always there physically, but mentally he was still in the desert." Divorces were common, emotional distance became normal. And yet, when asked if they regretted their service, many still said no. They believed in the mission, even when it broke them. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was thawing. The Soviet Union was weakening. Secrecy began to loosen cautiously. Declassification committees reviewed old programs. Files were opened, then closed again. The lost aircraft program remained untouched. Why? Because acknowledging it would raise uncomfortable questions. Why were lives lost without recognition? Why were billions spent on something never admitted? Why were citizens lied to for decades? It was easier to leave the past buried.
but time has a way of eroding silence. As participants aged, their fear of consequences slowly gave way to a deeper fear that their story would die with them. Some began leaving hints, a line in a memoir that didn't quite fit, an offhand comment at a reunion, a deathbed confession to a trusted friend. Journalists investigating Area 51 noticed patterns, similar descriptions, repeated themes, a craft that didn't officially exist, flights that weren't on any schedule, deaths without explanations. Still, without documents, everything remained deniable. One particularly tragic incident resurfaced through anonymous testimony. A veteran test pilot, known only by a call sign, was flying a late-stage prototype. Conditions were ideal. The flight was meant to validate recent modifications. Minutes after reaching test altitude, telemetry data went silent. Radar tracked the aircraft, descending rapidly before disappearing entirely. Recovery teams found debris scattered across miles of desert. The official report listed the cause as instrument failure during classified training. In truth, the aircraft had exceeded its thermal tolerance. Structural components failed mid-flight. The pilot never had a chance. His family received no explanation beyond a folded flag. For those who knew the truth, the guilt never faded. Years later, some of the same officials who ordered risky flights found themselves haunted by decisions they could never undo. Careers ended, reputations faded, power, once absolute, proved temporary. Several senior figures reportedly expressed regret in private conversations, acknowledging that ambition had sometimes overwritten caution. But regret, like secrecy, came too late. The Lost Aircraft program is not just a story about technology. It is a story about how far a nation will go when it believes survival is at stake, about how innovation can demand sacrifices history is unwilling to name. It forces an uncomfortable realization. Some of the freedoms enjoyed today were built on foundations the public was never meant to see, and perhaps never will. Despite everything, something remarkable has happened. The internet age has made permanent secrecy nearly impossible. Patterns emerge, stories connect, silence fractures. The truth doesn't arrive all at once, but in pieces. And with each piece, the men and women who lived in the shadows reclaim a fragment of dignity. They may never be publicly honored, but they are no longer completely forgotten.
How a program is deleted from history. Erasing a secret program is far more complex than simply locking away documents. It requires rewriting reality itself. For Area 51's Lost Aircraft program, the erasure happened on multiple levels: administrative, psychological, and cultural. First came the paperwork purge. Entire file systems were reclassified under unrelated project codes. Budgets were redistributed retroactively. Maintenance logs were altered to reference facility upgrades rather than flight operations. In some cases, documents were deliberately mislabeled with dates that predated the program itself, making timelines impossible to reconstruct. Second came the human silence. Personnel were reminded again that their non-disclosure agreements did not expire with retirement or death. Families were warned indirectly. A careless comment could mean loss of pensions, legal action, or public disgrace. Finally came the cultural overwrite. New narratives replaced old realities. Publicly acknowledged aircraft programs filled the historical space where the lost aircraft should have been. Museums displayed sleek stealth jets without mentioning the dangerous prototypes that paved the way. History moved forward selectively. Most people involved complied. Fear is a powerful motivator. So is loyalty. But a small number struggled deeply with obedience.
One engineer attempted to submit an anonymous letter to a congressional oversight committee in the early 1990s. The letter never arrived. 2 weeks later, he was visited by federal agents who asked polite but unsettling questions about his mental health and financial records. The message was clear. Anonymity was an illusion. Another former technician tried to publish a fictional novel that mirrored the program too closely. The manuscript was never released. The publisher abruptly dropped the project without explanation. These were not dramatic arrests or public scandals. They were quiet corrections. The system did not need to punish loudly. It only needed to remind people who was in control. As time passed, many participants experienced something deeper than trauma. They experienced moral injury. They had believed they were serving a noble cause, protecting their country, advancing humanity's understanding of flight. But as decades went by without acknowledgement, without honesty, that belief eroded. Some began to ask painful questions. Was the secrecy truly necessary? Were the risks justified? Did obedience make them complicit? For test pilots who lost friends, these questions were unbearable. One former pilot admitted anonymously, "I used to think dying for your country was the highest honor. Now I wonder what it means to die for a secret." Perhaps the cruelest consequence of the program was what it passed on to the next generation. Children grew up sensing something was wrong, but never knowing what. They learned that questions were dangerous, that curiosity had limits. Some inherited their parents' anxiety, distrust of authority, or emotional distance. Others rejected secrecy entirely, becoming journalists, activists, or historians determined to expose hidden truths. A few eventually discovered fragments of the story through declassified records, interviews, or leaked documents. For them, the realization was devastating. Their parents weren't absent or cold by choice. They were carrying a burden no one had helped them put down. Area 51 itself changed over time. New facilities were built, old hangars were repurposed or sealed. Satellite images revealed expansion, but never clarity. Some former workers believe remnants of the lost aircraft still exist beneath the desert, not operational, just preserved, like artifacts in a tomb. They argue that destroying the aircraft entirely would have been risky, too much evidence, too many witnesses. Burying it was safer. If true, then somewhere beneath Groom Lake, a machine decades ahead of its time still rests in darkness, its purpose fulfilled, its story untold. Governments rarely admit past wrongdoing unless forced. Acknowledging the lost aircraft program would require admitting that citizens died in experiments never publicly authorized, that billions were spent without oversight, that truth was sacrificed for strategy. It would open the door to lawsuits, compensation claims, and moral reckoning. So the door remains closed, not locked, just never acknowledged. Here lies the deepest irony. The program worked. Not perfectly, not safely, but effectively. Its failures taught engineers what not to do. Its breakthroughs shaped stealth design, thermal management, and radar evasion. Modern aircraft owe their existence to lessons learned in secret and paid for in silence. The world enjoys the benefits. The builders remain ghosts. As the decades pass, the number of living witnesses shrinks. Each year, more stories vanish forever. This creates urgency among historians and investigative journalists, not to expose classified technology, but to preserve human truth. Who were these people? What did they endure? What did it cost them? Because once the witnesses are gone, denial becomes permanent. Governments rarely admit past wrongdoing unless forced. Acknowledging the lost aircraft program would require admitting that citizens died in experiments never publicly authorized, that billions were spent without oversight, that truth was sacrificed for strategy. It would open the door to lawsuits, compensation claims, and moral reckoning. So the door remains closed, not locked, just never acknowledged. Here lies the deepest irony. The program worked. Not perfectly, not safely, but effectively. Its failures taught engineers what not to do. Its breakthroughs shaped stealth design, thermal management, and radar evasion. Modern aircraft owe their existence to lessons learned in secret and paid for in silence. The world enjoys the benefits. The builders remain ghosts. As the decades pass, the number of living witnesses shrinks. Each year, more stories vanish forever. This creates urgency among historians and investigative journalists, not to expose classified technology, but to preserve human truth. Who were these people? What did they endure? What did it cost them? Because once the witnesses are gone, denial becomes permanent. Governments rarely admit past wrongdoing unless forced. Acknowledging the lost aircraft program would require admitting that citizens died in experiments never publicly authorized, that billions were spent without oversight, that truth was sacrificed for strategy. It would open the door to lawsuits, compensation claims, and moral reckoning. So the door remains closed, not locked, just never acknowledged. Here lies the deepest irony. The program worked. Not perfectly, not safely, but effectively. Its failures taught engineers what not to do. Its breakthroughs shaped stealth design, thermal management, and radar evasion. Modern aircraft owe their existence to lessons learned in secret and paid for in silence. The world enjoys the benefits. The builders remain ghosts. As the decades pass, the number of living witnesses shrinks. Each year, more stories vanish forever. This creates urgency among historians and investigative journalists, not to expose classified technology, but to preserve human truth. Who were these people? What did they endure? What did it cost them? Because once the witnesses are gone, denial becomes permanent. Governments rarely admit past wrongdoing unless forced. Acknowledging the lost aircraft program would require admitting that citizens died in experiments never publicly authorized, that billions were spent without oversight, that truth was sacrificed for strategy. It would open the door to lawsuits, compensation claims, and moral reckoning. So the door remains closed, not locked, just never acknowledged. Here lies the deepest irony. The program worked. Not perfectly, not safely, but effectively. Its failures taught engineers what not to do. Its breakthroughs shaped stealth design, thermal management, and radar evasion. Modern aircraft owe their existence to lessons learned in secret and paid for in silence. The world enjoys the benefits. The builders remain ghosts. As the decades pass, the number of living witnesses shrinks. Each year, more stories vanish forever. This creates urgency among historians and investigative journalists, not to expose technology, but to preserve human truth. Who were these people? What did they endure? What did it cost them? Because once the witnesses are gone, denial becomes permanent. Supporters of secrecy argue that revealing everything could still endanger national security. Critics argue that perpetual secrecy endangers democracy. Both may be right, but somewhere between those extremes lies a simple human need: acknowledgement. Not of technical details, not of vulnerabilities, but of sacrifice. Despite decades of erasure, hope persists. Hope that one day a limited disclosure will occur, that names will be honored privately, if not publicly, that families will receive explanations, even partial ones. Hope that silence will no longer be the final chapter, because truth, even delayed, has power, and stories, once told, cannot be completely erased again. The age of leaks and accidental truths. The 21st century brought something the architects of Cold War secrecy never anticipated: permanent digital memory. Old assumptions that documents could disappear forever, that witnesses would eventually die, that silence would win by default, began to collapse. Former defense contractors started digitizing personal notes. Archivists scanned forgotten microfilm. Retired officials donated sanitized collections to libraries, never imagining what cross-referencing could reveal. Individually, these fragments meant nothing. Together, they told a story. A budget anomaly here, a test range expansion there, a missing aircraft designation that skipped entire number sequences. Researchers noticed the gaps, and gaps in historical records are often louder than facts. A new generation of journalists approached Area 51 differently than their predecessors. They didn't chase aliens, they chased accounting. They examined procurement contracts that listed exotic materials years before those materials were publicly known. They mapped shuttle routes that coincided suspiciously with rumored test windows. They interviewed former workers, not about UFOs, but about burnout, silence, and fear. Patterns emerged. The same years, the same locations, the same unspoken understanding. Something major had happened, and it had been buried. Editors were skeptical. Governments denied everything. Sources refused to go on record. Still, the investigation continued, because truth, once suspected, is hard to ignore. Then came the email, short, carefully worded, sent through layers of encryption. It didn't include blueprints or photos. It included something far more powerful: context. The sender described an aircraft program that matched the gaps perfectly: night flights, extreme speeds, fatal tests, no official name. He ended with a single sentence: "You're not crazy, you're just early." That message was never published, but it changed everything. In the years that followed, a handful of former participants began speaking, off the record. They chose their words cautiously, avoided specifics, never confirmed dates or names, but they confirmed experience: the fear, the exhaustion, the knowledge that history would never mention them. One engineer, now in his late 80s, said quietly, "We were told we were protecting the future. I just didn't realize the future would forget us." Another admitted, "The hardest part wasn't the danger, it was knowing no one would ever say thank you." These were not men seeking attention, they were men seeking peace. Official response never changed. No such program existed. All experimental projects have been appropriately documented. Claims to the contrary are speculative. This language was deliberate, not denial, deflection. By refusing to engage, officials avoided creating new records, avoided admitting uncertainty, avoided reopening old wounds. Silence remained policy. Hollywood unintentionally edged closer to reality than it realized. Films and television shows portrayed secret aircraft, black projects, buried hangars. Writers thought they were inventing drama. Some former insiders couldn't watch. Scenes mirrored memories too closely. Dialogue echoed real briefings. Set designs resembled actual facilities. One retired technician reportedly left a theater halfway through a movie, shaken. "Someone knows," he whispered to a friend. But who and how remained unclear. Truth has a way of leaking into imagination. As public trust in institutions declined in the early 2000s, questions about secrecy grew louder. Why were citizens kept in the dark for decades? Who decided which truths were too dangerous to share?
What did national security justify? The Lost Aircraft program became a silent case study in ethical ambiguity, not because it was publicly debated, but because it wasn't. Its absence raised the hardest questions of all. For families of those who died, the pain never resolved. They received no explanations, no closure, no acknowledgement. Some widows kept boxes of letters they were never allowed to open. Some children inherited medals they didn't understand. A few families pursued answers obsessively, filing FOIA requests, writing to representatives, collecting scraps of information. Most requests were denied, but occasionally a response arrived that said too much by saying too little. Records pertaining to your inquiry cannot be located. Not do not exist, cannot be located. To grieving families, that distinction mattered. In rare private ceremonies, quiet acknowledgments reportedly occurred. Unmarked gatherings, no press, no speeches, just a few officials and aging participants standing together in silence. No details were shared publicly, no photos released. But for those present, it meant something. Recognition, even unspoken, has power. The Lost Aircraft program never entered official history, but it reshaped it. It taught future planners the limits of secrecy, the cost of unchecked ambition, the danger of erasing people along with projects. Later programs adopted stricter safety oversight, more documentation, controlled disclosure. Progress born from pain. This story is not about conspiracy, it is about humanity, about what happens when fear outruns ethics, when innovation moves faster than accountability, when silence becomes policy. It reminds us that history is not only written by victors, but by survivors who wait decades to speak, and sometimes by those who never get the chance. If nothing else, telling this story fulfills a quiet promise that those who worked in the desert, under black skies, risking everything for a future they would never see, are remembered, even if only in whispers, even if only here.
The Last Witnesses. Time is relentless. By the 2010s, most of the men and women who had worked on Area 51's Lost Aircraft program were in their final years. Some lived quietly in desert towns. Others moved closer to family, carrying boxes of old notes they were never allowed to open. They watched the world change. Drones filled the skies, stealth aircraft became public knowledge, hypersonic weapons were openly discussed in congressional hearings. Everything they once risked their lives to protect was now normal, and yet their story remained absent. For many, this realization hurt more than the secrecy ever had. One former engineer reportedly said to his son, "They're proud of the future we helped build, but ashamed of how it was built." As mortality approached, fear lost its grip. Some spoke in fragments, others left recorded messages labeled simply, "In case I don't wake up." These were not technical briefings, they were human confessions. Apologies to spouses for emotional distance, regrets over flights that should never have been approved, pride in breakthroughs no one would ever credit them for. One test pilot, dying of cancer, reportedly told a nurse, "I flew something the world wasn't ready to see, and maybe it never will be." These words never made headlines, but they were heard. Professional historians approached the story cautiously. Without documents, history risks becoming rumor, but without testimony, it risks becoming propaganda. So they began building timelines from absence. Why did certain runways expand when no public aircraft required them? Why did specific materials appear in procurement records years early? Why did accident reports list pilots with no corresponding aircraft assignments? Each question added weight. Individually deniable, collectively undeniable.
academic papers cautiously referenced unidentified experimental aviation initiatives. Footnotes grew longer, language grew bolder. The wall of silence began to thin, not break, but weaken. Something subtle happened in official language. Press briefings stopped saying no such programs existed. Instead, they said, "We cannot comment on alleged historical projects." This shift mattered. It was not an admission, but it was no longer a denial. For those who had waited decades, it felt like a breath after suffocation. Some former decision-makers lived long enough to face reflection. Away from authority, away from power. They watched interviews, read articles, heard whispers of what people suspected, and they realized something unsettling. Control does not outlive time. Several reportedly admitted in private that secrecy had gone too far, that fear of the Soviet Union had justified cruelty that would be unacceptable today. Karma, when it came, was quiet. It arrived as regret. One question persisted above all others. Why not reveal the aircraft now? The answer, insiders suggest, is uncomfortable. The aircraft worked, but at a cost that modern audiences would find horrifying. Safety margins were thin. Human lives were treated as variables. Ethical lines were crossed. Revealing the program would not just inspire awe, it would provoke outrage. So the aircraft remains buried in silence, not to protect technology, but to protect reputations. Among former workers, a belief persists that somewhere beneath the Nevada desert, behind sealed blast doors, the aircraft still exists. Not operational, not powered, but preserved. A time capsule of ambition. If true, it is not waiting to fly. It is waiting to be understood. Despite everything, the program changed the world. Modern stealth aircraft trace their lineage to its failures. Hypersonic research echoes its experiments. Thermal materials used in space exploration evolved from its risks. The future arrived, carried forward by unnamed hands. The irony is painful. The world celebrates innovation while forgetting the innovators. In one rare interview, conducted under strict anonymity, a former engineer was asked a simple question. If you could go back, would you do it again? He paused for a long time. Yes, he said finally, but I would demand one thing. What? That when it was over, someone would remember us. This story exists for that reason. Not to expose blueprints, not to endanger security, not to chase sensationalism, but to honor human truth. To say that courage existed in silence, that sacrifice happened without applause, that history is incomplete without its shadows. The truth about Area 51's lost aircraft program may never be officially confirmed, but it no longer needs to be. Because truth is not only written in documents, it is written in patterns, in memory, in the cost paid by human lives, and sometimes in the stories we choose to tell.
When silence no longer works. Every secret depends on one fragile assumption, that time will erase memory. Area 51's lost aircraft program was built on that belief, that the desert would outlast witnesses, that loyalty would outlive conscience, that fear would outlive truth. But time did something unexpected. It didn't erase the story, it sharpened it. As the last witnesses aged, as archives digitized, as patterns became impossible to ignore, the silence surrounding the program stopped feeling powerful and started feeling fragile. Because silence only works when no one is listening. And now the world was listening differently. A new generation grew up without the Cold War's existential fear.
They did not instinctively accept secrecy as necessary. They asked uncomfortable questions. Why should the truth expire? Why should sacrifice remain anonymous forever? Why should patriotism require erasure? Students writing theses, engineers studying aviation history, analysts reviewing declassified budgets, they noticed the same thing again and again: a missing chapter. Aircraft programs that jumped from crude concepts to advanced designs too quickly. Technological leaps with no visible developmental bridge. That bridge, many began to suspect, had been burned on purpose. For decades, families had been silent out of fear or exhaustion. Now some chose differently. Children of engineers began sharing stories publicly. Not technical details, but emotional truths. My father worked somewhere he couldn't name. My mother waited years for explanations she never got. My family paid a price we were never told about. These accounts did not reveal classified information. They revealed humanity. And humanity is harder to dismiss than speculation. Governments are good at hiding facts. They are terrible at hiding consequences. The lost aircraft program left fingerprints everywhere, on technology, on people, on history itself. And slowly, the myth of perfect secrecy collapsed. Not with a single revelation, but with thousands of small realizations, enough to make denial sound hollow. At its core, the lost aircraft was more than a machine. It represented a moment in history when fear justified everything. A time when survival felt uncertain, when the world stood on the edge of annihilation, when leaders believed that if they failed, nothing else would matter. In that mindset, ethics bend, transparency disappears, humans become resources. The aircraft was born from that fear, and it carried that fear into the sky. This is the reckoning history rarely gives us, not a courtroom, not a verdict, but understanding. Understanding that progress is rarely clean, that innovation often leaves scars, that national survival can demand terrible choices, but also understanding this: secrecy without accountability always extracts a debt, and that debt is paid by people who never consented to disappear. This story does not end with disclosure. It does not end with blueprints released or hangars opened. It ends with something quieter and more important: recognition. Recognition that men and women worked in silence, believing they were protecting a future they would never be allowed to explain. Recognition that their sacrifices mattered, even if official history refuses to say so. Recognition that truth does not require permission to exist. Imagine the Nevada desert at night. The wind moves across dry earth. Stars burn overhead. Silence stretches endlessly. Somewhere beneath that desert, whether physically or metaphorically, rests an aircraft that once defied imagination. It will never fly again, but its story has. Area 51 will always be wrapped in mystery, but mystery does not mean myth. Behind every classified project are real people, real risks, real consequences. And sometimes the most important truths are not the ones governments confirm, but the ones humanity refuses to forget. This has been Untold Golden History, where forgotten truths rise from silence and history is finally allowed to speak. Hungry for untold secrets like this? Subscribe and follow Untold Golden History, where the truth refuses to stay hidden.